Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this year's Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture in the Arts, titled Stories and Histories, a Conversation with Celeste Ng. Before I introduce our speaker, let me take a moment to thank Kim and Judy Davis, whose support makes this lecture series possible. I'm also grateful to members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Our speaker today is the award-winning novelist and Harvard alumna, Celeste Ng. Celeste is the author of 3 best-selling novels: Everything I Never Told You, which Amazon named the #1 book of 2014, Little Fires Everywhere, which the New York Times called utterly engrossing, often heartbreaking, and deeply empathetic, and Our Missing Hearts, which according to Booklist, arguably achieves literary perfection. Beyond her novels, Celeste's writing has appeared in numerous prestigious publications, and her many honors include the Pushcart Prize, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. In her work, Celeste deploys fiction to powerful effect, as her stories engage profound subjects including family, gender, race, community, cultural identity, and immigrant experiences. And elements of Celeste's own story infuse her fiction. Celeste grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is also the setting for Little Fires Everywhere. Reflecting on her own experiences, she's discussed growing up as one of a small number of Asian Americans in these suburban communities. Many of us feel different in some way, she observed in an interview, but it's really jarring when one of your differences is obvious at a glance. Other people can tell you're different simply by looking at you, she concluded. This experience of feeling different is echoed in many of her characters' lives, particularly in Celeste's keenly observed portrayals of people of color in majority white spaces. And just as Celeste's own life experiences help to inform the stories she tells, so her novels often depict characters whose personal histories, shape their present-day actions in crucial ways. Everything I Never Told You, for example, tells the story of Marilyn, a stay-at-home mother and former Radcliffe College student who once dreamed of becoming a doctor. An unexpected pregnancy, however, puts her ambitions on hold, and she responds by placing relentless academic pressure on her eldest daughter. The past looms large for Marilyn's husband, James, as well. After his lonely childhood as the only student of Asian descent in his schools, he's anxious for his children to have active social lives, even going so far as to give his daughter a copy of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Similarly, Celeste's second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, presents the character of Mia, an artist who travels the country with her teenage daughter, refusing to live in the same place for long. And though Mia never speaks about her past, the novel slowly reveals how much her personal history has determined why she lives the way she does. The novel contrasts Mia with Elena Richardson, a lifelong Shaker Heights resident and mother of 4, who simultaneously grows fascinated with Mia and judges the other woman for her choices. Speaking about her characters at the 2018 National Book Festival, Celeste commented that she's interested in the life not lived, or as she further explained, the idea that you'd make a choice and you always are going to wonder about what if I had made a different choice. This attention to contingent circumstances that shape who people are The sense of relief or regret that comes from the knowledge of how easily things might have been different is part of what makes Celeste's writing so captivating and emotionally resonant. This afternoon, we'll have the opportunity to hear Celeste's reflections on histories and stories we tell, and she'll be joined in conversation by my colleague, Erika Lee. Erika is the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Foundation Faculty Director of the Radcliffe Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America. She's also a Radcliffe Alumnae Professor and the inaugural Bay Family Professor of History in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. An award-winning scholar of immigration and Asian American history, Erika is the author of 5 books, including The Making of Asian America, A History, and America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, which won an American Book Award and an Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, among other honors. Prior to joining Harvard, Erika was Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies and Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Following Celeste and Erika's conversation, we'll open the floor to audience questions. Whether you're watching us in person or online, you can submit questions at any time using the Slido link that's provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. I want to thank both of our speakers for being with us today, and now please join me in warmly welcoming Celeste Ng and Erika Lee to the stage.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. It's wonderful to be here. And Erika, thank you for being in conversation. Kimiko, thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Celeste, I'm so excited to have this conversation. We've known each other and each other's work for many, many years, but only virtually, online.
Only on the magic of social media,
yes. And then we met a few months ago to talk about this event, and we couldn't stop talking. We had to keep on saying, let's not talk about that now because we're going to save it for the conversation.
I think it was a 30-minute call, and about 15 minutes elapsed before Dean Wasserman was like, we will not have a shortage of things to talk about.
Yes.
So yeah, been looking forward to this.
Absolutely. You're going to get you're going to be flies on one of our conversations. So I have notes. I have little tabs as well. And I wanted to start our conversation about writing, about storytelling, about Asian American stories, and the art of politics by drawing specifically from Our Missing Hearts, your most recent novel. And you've described how you began it in the fall of 2016 when nothing really happened. And you've described how the tumult of those times impacted your writing and turned what you thought was a novel about a boy and his mother into a dystopian world. You write in the afterword, I believe, that Bird and Margaret, the 2 characters in the book, Bird and Margaret's world isn't exactly our world, but it isn't not ours either. Most of the events and occurrences in this book do not have direct analogs, but I drew inspiration from many real-life events, both past and current, and in some cases, things I'd imagined had become realities by the time that the novel was done. So for those of you who may not have read Our Missing Hearts, or it's been a while, it opens up about 10 years after a law has been passed in the United States, the Pact Law. Can you tell us a little bit about the Pact Law and how it impacts our characters?
Sure. So in the novel, this fictional series of laws called the Pact Laws, they stand for Protecting American Culture and Traditions. And this is one of the many cases in which I was really hoping that our world would move farther away from the novel. That has not been the case so far, but let's keep hoping. These laws essentially require people to sort of act patriotically, to adhere to what's seen as American culture, in heavy quotation marks. And it encourages citizens to report any instances of unpatriotic or un-American behavior. And finally, it also stipulates that if people are found espousing un-American views, that for their children's protection, their children can be removed from the home and placed in the custody of someone who will give them a more appropriate American upbringing.
Mm-hmm. So there's all sorts of hints about what this world is like. It's actually set in Cambridge, right here. We follow characters who go into public libraries and find empty, dusty shelves. We learn that many, many books have been removed and turned into pulp.
Preemptively removed, I should say,
Removed.
out of concern that they might bring, trouble to the institutions that hold them.
Mm-hmm. And characters very close to my heart are librarians who are amongst the heroes. They have established an underground information network, passing notes hidden in books, helping people identify and keep track of some of the children who have been removed from families and households because allegedly their parents are dangerous to their upbringing. So can you bring us into the process of writing from 2016 to 2022 when the book was published? And then how are you feeling about the characters, the themes, the narrative arc today in 2025?
Oh, it's a lot. I'll take you back to the beginning of starting to work on the novel. Erika, as you said, when I got the idea for this, it really was focused on this mother and this son. The mother's Margaret, who is a Chinese-American woman, and her son, who's mixed race. His father's white, and he goes by the nickname Bird. And it actually came out of something very personal, which was that prior to 2016, I had been doing a lot of book tours. I was on the road a lot. I was away from home a lot. My son was quite young at the time. And I was thinking, does he resent me being away from home so much? The answer, as it turns out, is no, in case anyone's wondering. It turns out that when I'm not home, he and his father order pizza, and they have a great time, and I think they miss me, but they're also totally fine on their own, which is a huge relief. But if any of you have read my second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, there's a mother in that who is an artist, and she asks her daughter to sacrifice quite a bit for her art. And I started thinking, well, what if the child in question was not fully on board? What if the child in question didn't realize why it was that her mother wanted to do this? And that, combined with my own sort of real-life situation, kind of led to this. I started thinking about, well, what is it that a mother who's creative might feel she needed to sacrifice for her child? And what would happen if those two things came into conflict with each other? What would happen if the child saw his mother's creative work as a rival, even, for his affection for his mother's time? And so, as you say, I was writing this, I was getting this idea as I was preparing. I just finished writing the manuscript for Little Fires Everywhere, and as you say, it was a very calm and normal time, and nothing was happening. And as I started to write this novel, our country started to take a pretty sharp turn, and we started to see the effects of the first Trump administration and what he decided to do with that power, and what people were willing to let him get away with. And as I saw that, it reminded me of a lot of things that I had learned about in history. And I started to think, where are we going here? I started reading back into history, and all of that started kind of leaching its way into the novel. The novel essentially became what became described as a dystopian novel. Although even at the time, when it came out in 2022, I would say, well, I think it's useful for us to ask, how far away from reality is this? What I always ended up saying about it was that this is a novel that's maybe 1 or 2 degrees off of our reality, And a reviewer referred to it as maybe this is America in like 10 to 20 minutes. And unfortunately, I think some of those things are true. So to get to the second half of your question, how am I feeling right now? I really wish that we as a country learned more from our history. I should say I'm not a prophet. I am not psychic in any way. I think we often talk about people as being Cassandras, and we forget that Cassandra not only knew it was going to happen, but was never listened to, and that's a really tragic thing. What happened really was that I, while writing this novel, looked at history. I tried to learn more about other times in which authoritarians took charge in different countries, in different time periods, and then I tried to imagine what would happen if that were the case now. And it didn't take a lot of imagining, honestly. There's patterns that we have. And so part of my feeling as I sort of watch what's unfolding, and I think we're very much in a moment where there's a lot happening and we don't fully know exactly what is going to come next. We have some good ideas, but every day brings new surprises. It's sort of a moment of really kind of asking myself the questions that I think characters in the novel had to ask, which is, what can I do as one person? These are very, very big problems. These are societal problems. It's going to take a lot of people working together. What can I as an individual do? Is there anything that I can do? And those are the questions that I'm asking myself every day, honestly.
So in the novel, there's a certain population that is particularly targeted, particularly under suspicion as national security threats. They're known under the acronym POWs, or Persons of Asian Origin. You started in 2016, you're, I assume, writing, developing the storyline, editing during the deepest part of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw a rise in anti-Asian violence, hate crimes, et cetera. Was the Persons of Asian Origin storyline, them being targeted, under suspicion, there are scenes of violence in the book. Was that always part of the storyline from the beginning?
It was always part of the storyline because as a Chinese American writer, that's something that I've always been aware of. I think when violence against Asian Americans started happening during the beginning months of COVID-19, a lot of people, I think, were really surprised. And most of the Asian people that I knew were not surprised at all, because I think we had always been aware that this was a possibility. The violence against us was always sort of imminent and something that we had to watch out for. And so when writing, I felt very conscious that I didn't want to speak about other groups, but I knew that I could talk about what I myself had experienced. And so I wanted to try and highlight that one aspect, because one thing that struck me is that I think many people don't know what it is that Asian Americans often face in America. My first novel focuses on a mixed-race family where the mother is white and the father is a Chinese American. And they marry in the 1950s, and the novel takes place in the mid-1970s. And after it came out, a lot of people said to me, with the best of intentions, I am so glad I read this, because I never realized that Asian Americans face discrimination. And I was taken aback by this, but I also thought, okay, well, I'm really glad that you know that now. How are you going to know that if you don't hear about it? And so in a way, I was like, well, then I'm happy to have been able to let you know, / I'm sorry to be the bearer of this bad news. But it's a sort of thing where you don't know what you don't know. And so if this is a moment where you can find out about it, you can. And so I wanted to highlight that. And then, of course, as the COVID pandemic kept going, as we started to hear a lot of the most hateful rhetoric and see a lot of the violence, it really felt important to, in a way, sort of bear witness to that. There's a scene in the book that is taken directly from the news, and it was a place where I really wanted to demonstrate what kind of violence you can face just for having an Asian American face.
And bystanders who have done nothing.
Yeah, this isn't a spoiler, I promise, but there was an incident that happened in New York. There were many incidents of really atrocious violence just on the street, but there was one in New York that, for me, stood out, which was that a person was stomped in public in Midtown Manhattan in the middle of the day, and that's chilling enough, but what I think made this one stand out for me in particular was that nobody did anything except for the doorman of the building that this happened in front of. And he came out and he closed the door. And that, for me, is a whole other level. And this was caught on tape because there's cameras everywhere in Manhattan. And that amount of disengagement, or that amount of saying, that's not my problem, that was a little bit of a shock to me, because I guess I'm an optimist and I like to think the best of humankind and human nature. And that was really startling. And so I wanted in some ways to ask people to witness that and to call attention to that.
There's several layers of erasure that I'm noticing in your answer just now. One is the erasure amongst so many individuals, including Asian Americans during the pandemic,
Yes,
who also
absolutely.
shared, I thought we were okay. I thought we were safe. I'm shocked.
Absolutely.
And then there's the erasure that's happening with censorship in Bird's education. And then there's the erasure of even just being witness to this very real act of violence. So how in your writing, so beyond the bearing witness to these ongoing acts of violence by inserting this very real example, and I think we've talked about this as well. I remember in rereading the book, identifying other hate crimes, other victims that I remember in the pandemic being characters here. How do you go about with your writing to counter erasure in multiple ways? So not just bringing in everyday, or not every day, hopefully, but real events and then putting them into fiction. How else? What are some other approaches that you use?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance because as a writer of fiction, I'm obviously making things up, right? But a lot of what I draw on is either personal experience or things that I've witnessed. I think I'd say that none of my books are autobiographical, but all of them have something of me and something of my experience in there, right? I think there's a kinship that I feel with each of the characters. And for me, finding that personal connection is part of how I hopefully make those characters feel like real people. And so I'm constantly trying to balance making things up with bringing facts in, right? Making this world feel real, but also acknowledging that it's fictional. And one of the things that goes along with that is if I'm trying to talk about stories that I feel like have not been told, or trying to highlight groups or experiences that have not been seen, I want to make them visible. And yet, I think that Asian Americans in particular exist on this very strange spectrum where at one end you have invisibility, which is that you are completely erased. If you look at a lot of the surveys, there's respondents for white, there's respondents for black, there's respondents for sometimes Latinx. There's very seldom an Asian column. And if there is, it's not disaggregated. And Asian Americans are a very, very diverse group with very different experiences and viewpoints. And so there's this sense in which you are not seen at all, right? Or we're not, I had no idea that Asian Americans faced racism, right? Or we're just not thinking about them. At the other end of that spectrum is this kind of hyper-visibility, this idea that either you are being held up as the scapegoat, and we see that a lot, unfortunately, increasingly in political rhetoric, where China is seen as our economic rival. And therefore, anybody who is Chinese or who potentially might be Chinese is suspect, right? You're suddenly got a spotlight on you that you maybe did not intend to have. Or you're also sometimes made hyper visible when you're held up as the model minority. When you're like, look at that person there, they're doing a great job, how come everybody else isn't doing that kind of job? And you're used as this sort of wedge to push other groups out of the center or even downwards. And for Asian Americans in particular, having to kind of navigate between those two poles, I feel a parallel to that in writing fiction, in that I want to highlight these stories, and yet I'm also aware that A, I can't tell all these stories, and B, that there is a downside to visibility. We talk about visibility a lot as an absolutely positive thing, and the truth is that there are downsides to that as well. And so trying to figure out, how much research do I put in? How much do I try and make it like real life? And then also, how much is that possible? How much of it should I fictionalize or make up? That's always the balance that I think I'm trying to strike in all of my fiction.
And for historians, we're trying to strike that balance between the past is unknowable, yet I need it to be legible. There's such a diversity of experiences, yet I need to show and represent as much as possible. I think one of the reasons why I love your novel so much is because I can see that historical threads through.
That means a lot coming from you. So as you know, I'm a fan of your own work, and your books were some of the ones that I turned to while I want to make sure that if I have something in the book that seems like a fact, I want to try and get it right. And so I turned to, The Making of Asian America, for example, and I'm like, let me make sure that what I'm saying lines up with history, because fiction is not history, but I want to try and get those facts right where I can. I really think that history, what you and I do, is two sides of the same coin, in a way.
Right, so storytelling from two different genres that may seem they are very different, but I think when we're talking about process and goals, I actually think they're quite the same.
I think they are too. I think that they have the same goal in mind, and they just sort of come in different directions. Right. One of the things that I think history and any kind of nonfiction can do that's really powerful is it can say, this is a real thing that happened. I am testifying to this. And when you hear someone say, no, this actually happened to me, for some people, and in some cases, that makes it more believable in a way, right? You're like, I'm telling you that it was there. I was an eyewitness. This is why we have eyewitnesses at trials, right? And there is something really important and powerful about someone saying, I experienced this, and I'm here to tell you what I saw and what I felt. I think sometimes, though, there are people who shy away from that because it's too upfront, it's too raw, it's too harsh, and I'm not making judgment, rightly or wrongly, about, how they react. But that for some people, fiction can kind of come in sideways, in a way. It can kind of get around your immediate reaction to what might be the front page of the newspaper, or to the headlines. I think we saw this a lot. Certainly during the first Trump administration, particularly around the separation of families at the border. There were a lot of people that I knew who care and are engaged, and they reached saturation point, and I can't blame them, where they were just like, I can't look at the headlines anymore. And again, I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but it's hard to still reach those people, right? It's really easy to tune out and to turn into something else. And one of the things that I think did cut through that was, I don't know if anybody here remembers this, there started to be essentially art installations that would pop up in different cities, and they were little chain link cages. And inside them were little figures that were wrapped in those kind of Mylar space blankets, and they had, someone had managed to smuggle out recordings of what it sounded like in the detention centers where children who'd been separated from their parents were being kept. And they played that soundtrack in these cages, so you would hear children crying. And is it a stunt? Yeah, of course it's a stunt, but I do think that was able to catch some people's attention, and in a way, like if you kind of bypass the intellect and you go straight into the emotions, sometimes you can spur people to action in that way. And so I feel like we need both of these things in a way, whether you're coming from the history first and you're moving towards the story, or you're coming from the story and then you're trying to move towards the sort of real life connection. I think they work in different ways, but they end up hopefully in the same place.
I'm now realizing 2 specific scenes that are drawn from this inspiration then. So there's an installation that is happening at Cambridge Commons, which is, I don't know which direction.
I'm totally turned around as to where we are.
Way.
Somewhere out there.
And then the other is what Margaret does at the very end, yeah.
Yeah, I was really struck by that, by many other pieces of what I guess we could call like resistance art.
For sure, yeah.
I don't know if any of you remember that there were these naked Trump statues that would periodically appear in different cities. The idea being, the emperor has no clothes, and let's just show that. If you remember the bull that they have the New York Stock Exchange, overnight there is this little girl who appeared and was there, right? In a way, what the art is doing, you'll notice that in a way that you might just walk on past somebody who's holding up the newspaper, but it's a little bit different to go, wait, was that statue here before? And that catches your attention. And so one of the things that happens in Our Missing Hearts, and that's exactly why it happens, is that people who don't have a way to call attention to something that they feel is being forgotten can use art in some ways to kind of short circuit that and catch people in their everyday life, essentially.
I just want to remind everybody here in person, and then those of you joining on Zoom, that you can submit questions for Celeste at any time during our conversation. You can do it via the QR code, and we will get to as many as possible in about 12 minutes or so.
Please do ask questions, big, small, about writing, about the books, about
Celeste will
anything.
even share her favorite writing snack. So big and small, she really means that.
Well, I can answer that now, which is that I usually drink tea and I eat candy while I'm writing.
Nice.
You need
Caffeine
sugar,
and
you need a
sugar.
little caffeine.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great.
But whatever questions you have, we'll try and answer them. So.
I wanted to get back to the process of writing because I think it's the same between fiction and nonfiction, history and novels. We begin with a question. And maybe it's a series of questions, and we may not necessarily answer all of them at the end, but it's the writing process that allows us to explore the possibilities. What's the question that you're working on now?
I'm in the process of articulating what that question is to myself, which sounds like a dodge, and I don't mean it to be. What I've always found in each of my novels so far, and it's proving true with this current project, is that writing the first draft is where I tend to figure out what my question even is. This is a very inefficient process, but art is not efficient, and as we're learning, efficiency is maybe not everything. It has something to do, I think a lot of the questions that run through all 3 of my novels, I think will probably just inform a lot of my work. So part of them are questions about what happens, it's often called otherness, but I'm tending to think about it as what happens when the way that people see you from the outside doesn't match who you know yourself to be on the inside. And how do you kind of bridge that gap? How do you reconcile those 2 things? Can you get other people to bridge that gap as well and see you the way that you see yourself? Also questions about what art can do in the world. Is it just kind of window dressing, or does it have a larger purpose? Spoiler, I do think that it has a larger purpose. But the question is, what can it do? It's not the same as action, but it can also be an action. So there's something complicated there that I'm interested in finding out what the power of art is and also what the limitation of art is. The other thing that I'm thinking about in particular with this novel, and I've found myself researching a wide variety of fields that don't, I'm still figuring out how they fit together, but many of you may know that I am a miniaturist, and as a hobby, I make scale miniatures. So I've gotten really interested in the history of that, which runs back much farther than you'd think and is more complicated than it sounds like it would be. I'm also now researching the Opium War, which is a subject of interest to me because my family comes from Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, some of you may know, was right at the center of the outcomes of the Opium Wars. I'm figuring out sort of how that fits together and what role history plays as it gets kind of passed on. So particularly the legacy of the Opium War. I only learned this recently, but there's a huge legacy of opium and the opium trade here in Boston.
For sure.
Two of the biggest opium trading firms were based here in Boston. And as a result, a lot of things in Boston that were funded by these companies were funded on opium money. So to take one example, one of the companies was called Perkins and Company. And that is why the Perkins School for the Blind is called the Perkins School for the Blind. They were in financial difficulties. Mr. Perkins said, "You do good work, I can help you out with that." It gets complicated to know when you have these legacies, what do we do about that? I mean, there's a parallel there, I think, to chattel slavery, where you're saying a lot of our country is built on money from slave owners, and what do we do about that? Can we make that right? How do we make that right? What are we responsible for? So I think those are the questions. As you can tell, they're still very diffuse at this point, but they are largely questions sort of about how art can help us with any of this, and about what we do with what we get handed from the people who came before us. What are we going to pass on to the people after us?
I think you might be a historian, Celeste. I do. Because I think that so many of us who teach and write history, we're asking exactly the same questions. How do we make sense of history of the present?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because you mentioned before, your love for librarians, and I also have a huge love for librarians. One of the things that I think is really amazing about them and about archivists, kind of cousins and, between historians and librarians, all of those professions, I think, have in common that they feel like it's important for us to remember stuff, to put it in its most basic terms. Like, we should record this, we should remember this. And when you do that, you realize, okay, we can learn stuff from this in the future. Maybe we could identify some patterns. Maybe this can influence what we're going to do in the future, right? But none of that can happen if you don't remember stuff, right? At its most basic level. And I think that's where fiction kind of can enter the conversation too. A lot of times those stories aid you in remembering stuff. Those are also a form of remembering in and of themselves, even if different from what archivists do, from what historians do. It all, in some ways, helps you see patterns. Because if you don't look at the patterns, if you just forget everything that went before, then everything that comes is a complete surprise, and you have no idea what's going to happen, and you have no idea how to proceed, right? Your life is just utter chaos from one moment to the next, and no one really wants to live like that. And all of that starts with remembering.
Yes.
Yeah.
I keep telling my students, as a historian, I'm always trying to correct misperceptions of what history is and why it's important, because I think we have some challenges in teaching history and some of the earlier levels. And I'm encouraging my students to always think about history as a verb, that it's every act and choice from the moment that a document is recorded, created, and moving forward. We make conscious decisions to preserve it, to make it accessible, to make sure that we are documenting the fullest, most complete record. And I love the scene in the book where one of the librarians that Bird comes into contact first is describing why she is engaged in this work, this underground fugitive network of information. And she apparently, is a descendant of Native Americans who had been incarcerated or put into the indigenous boarding schools. And she goes through this history, and she realizes very soon that Bird, the protagonist, has no idea what she's talking about, because he has lived under an era where all of these topics are banned and there aren't even books available to him. So history is not just about filling in those gaps, but you don't realize how important that is in terms of moving forward, proceeding, understanding what's at stake until that is completely erased, which is so nicely encapsulated here.
Yeah, and I love that you said that, and in a sense also you can't know what you don't know, right? Yeah. So if that history gets erased, you have no idea that there was even something there, right? And to be fair, I think there are many people who still don't really know about the so-called boarding schools, at Carlisle and elsewhere. It was relatively recently, certainly within the past few years, that I think that Canada even sort of made a statement about their history of dealing with Indigenous peoples. And a couple weeks ago, it was February break here, and I took my family to go to San Francisco. And we went to, we have family there, but we also went to Angel Island, which is an immigration station where many Chinese Americans who were coming from the Pacific side were essentially incarcerated, sometimes for a few days, but sometimes for many months. And I felt like it was important for my son to know this, because if he doesn't hear it from me, where's he going to learn it from? We never talked about it in school. We never, that just wasn't part of the history book. If it was there, it might have been in one of those little boxes, and we definitely skipped over that. Likewise, we went into the Presidio, which is a big park there, and they had a museum that was running an exhibit about Japanese exclusion and about the Japanese internment camps. And my son actually, as it turns out, has been talking about this in school. They're talking about it in history, which I think is fantastic. But I was like, okay, let's go in there and look, because if we don't kind of keep these stories alive, you don't even know what you're missing out on. You're missing out on a huge amount of context that it feels really important, certainly now, for you to have.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that you went to Angel Island and saw the poems and met with some of the staff there.
It was really meaningful. I had grown up knowing about Angel Island a little bit because I think my mother likewise was like, you need to know about this. And so when I was actually quite young, potentially too young, but don't tell her that, she gave me these books that are the poems that the people who were incarcerated while they were there over weeks, months, carved into the walls. And so they're these really sad poems about, feeling caged, about having come all this way and now not knowing if they were going to stay and so on. And so I grew up knowing about this. And so to go there and see it for the first time was actually hugely powerful.
And if you haven't gone to Angel Island, you must go the next time you go to San Francisco, but you can also read about them and read some of the poetry if you go to the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation website.
Yeah.
We just have to plug that.
Yes,
so.
Just Google. The poems are really quite beautiful, and I didn't realize until I was there. I thought, there's a couple poems here and there. They're on almost every surface of the barracks, like all the walls, they're all in there, and they've been painted over, and so some of them are almost illegible. Mm-hmm. And I learned from the park ranger that they were actually going to tear the building down because it hadn't been used for some time. And it was derelict, essentially, and they were going to the Park Service was going to tear it down, and then people went in and were like, maybe we should keep these. Maybe this is an important thing that we should keep. And this goes, I think, exactly to what we're talking about, this idea of if that history gets erased, nobody remembers what happened. All of that potential knowledge is completely gone.
I just need to, so the Angel Island story is very personal to me because not only did my grandparents come through Angel Island, but also many of my mentors were the ones who went to the California Park Service in the 1970s to say, we cannot tear this building down, and this is why. And they were the ones who went out and collected the oral histories, they preserved the poems, they wrote the first drafts of history, they created the archives and the historical societies so that now I and now you and your son could go and visit, and it's a National Historic Landmark now.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. I think that we are close to the Q&A session, so if you haven't had a chance to put down your questions, and I see we have some already.
Enter your questions.
You still have time.
And they magically appear on the
They magically appear on this iPad. But I still have the prerogative to ask one last
Yes,
question.
please.
You are an alumnus of Harvard, and you met this afternoon with some of our students.
I did. It was wonderful.
Yes, so I wanted to ask, what questions did they ask of you? What advice did you give them, reflecting on what you learned as a student here, what might have changed since then, how did you help them understand your path?
I hope I helped them understand something. It was wonderful to talk to the students, honestly. I don't get a chance to talk to students very often, and it was particularly meaningful to get to talk to students, from my alma mater. A lot of them had questions, I think, unsurprisingly for Harvard students, they had very big questions. But I feel like one through line from what the students were asking had to do with essentially like what comes next, what's the future of reading, writing, I think for students now, there is a huge pressure towards fields that will allow you to have a career that lets you afford food and shelter. And for a lot of people, English is not maybe the first choice that you think of when you're thinking about your future career. I think that was starting to happen when I was an undergrad here, and it's understandable because you need to have food and shelter. Those are very important. And yet at the same time, I think it is really important in some ways to hold on to your humanity. That's why we call them the humanities. My sister is a mechanical engineer, but she chose, rather than go to MIT, she wanted to go to Princeton because at the time that she was going, Princeton, in fact, required you to take many humanities classes, and she wanted that. She did not want to be in an environment where, at least her perception at the time, was that you could just take your engineering and science courses and forget about everything else. And in fact, I think the courses that she refers to most often in her daily life are the humanities courses. You want, in some ways, to know how to read, to connect with other people, essentially, through their work, to analyze what people are saying, in other words, to think about what people are saying and decide what's good information, what's not good information, what are your biases here, what's useful, how do I put this in context, right? And I'd argue, too, that it's really important that you also know how to write, because writing is an extension of thinking, essentially. We didn't end up talking about AI, which is fine because there's probably way too much to say. But one of the concerns I think that I have with AI, aside from the ethical and environmental ones, is that it's short-circuiting what should be your thinking process. If you're asking AI to write your first draft, that was the space in which you hopefully were going to be thinking about stuff. And there was a study that just came out this morning where they've actually done a scientific study, and they basically found that if you were using AI to write your first drafts or to analyze your first things, essentially, to paraphrase, the more you use it, the less your brain gets exercised. And essentially, you kind of lose that ability to do that critical thinking. And so, in talking with the students, they were understandably sort of like, what's going to be the future? And I didn't have answers, but I was like, here are some things that I'm thinking about, and I hope that feeds into their thinking.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions that continue on the line of writing, and also specifically Asian American writing. And so I'm going to try to condense a couple of them and ask a question that considers your reflection on sort of the state of this, just smallest question, but your experiences on where Asian American novels, fiction has grown, changed, developed in the past, 15 years. And I'll offer a little bit of context to ask whether it's been the same experience for you. When I was first starting to publish Asian American history books, I would hear some skepticism about whether we really needed so many of them, because X, Y, and Z publisher had already decided on publishing their one Asian American history book for that year.
We already have an
We
Asian
already
writer
have
in
one.
the cat. This is something that honestly people
Happens.
say in
Yeah.
publishing.
Yeah.
It happens. I think that is sometimes still true. I do think we have made a lot of progress. I'll say that when I was growing up, my mom made a really big effort to have Asian American literature around for herself, but I think also for me. She basically would buy any book that was by or about Asian Americans, and so this led to me having like a lot of books about like Japanese internment when I was a child on my bookshelf, and I read them. But I think that things are starting to change. It's always incremental and slow, and I think it always takes more pushing than it feels like it should. But when I was in high school, for example, basically the only Asian American writer that anybody had ever heard of was Amy Tan. When I got to college, you then kind of branched out into two. You had Amy Tan, and then you had Maxine Hong Kingston. Right, I was like, you all know who's coming next, right? And they are wonderful, right? But they are not the only ones who are out there. But I think for a long time, they were kind of pushed up as they were like the one on the pedestal. And what I always like to say is this is not like Highlander. It's not like there can only be one, and in order to win, you have to like punch someone off of the pedestal. Like that's not how this works. But when I wanted to become a writer, people would always say, oh, so you want to be the next Amy Tan? And I would always say, no, because we write very different things. We've had very different experiences. Also, I want her to continue to be around. I don't want to like dethrone her and replace her. I actually wrote an essay with the title, I Don't Want to Be the Next Amy Tan. And then many years later, I got to interview Amy Tan, and I had to kind of confess this to her. But what I have seen in the past, like 15 years or so, is I think there's been an increased understanding that there's not a single story that encompasses certainly not all Asian Americans, but not even all Chinese Americans, and not even all Chinese American women. Like there are many different stories within each one of those groups. And so what I'm starting to see, at least, is I'm starting to see not only more stories, but a recognition that there are lots of different experiences out there. So we're getting stories that are not specifically about being Asian, and I'll put quotes around all of those words, but in which the character's ethnicity, background, experience are part of what shapes them and part of the story, but maybe not the whole thing. So one example that I saw in the past couple of years was, it's called Central Places by Delia Tsai. And it's about a woman who goes home to visit her family in the Midwest. She's grown and she's going back. She was a teenager in the 90s in the Midwest. So I felt a real kinship with this as another Asian American teenager in the 90s. And the character's Asianness is part of the story, but it is largely a story about essentially sort of like a second coming of age, about coming home and recognizing that your parents are fallible, recognizing that the place you grew up in is both bigger and smaller than you thought it was, and of recognizing the ways in which you might have sold it short, but that also you may have grown past it. And so all of those complicated things, we're starting to see a lot more stories in which we see nuance and complexity in there. And that's something that I find really encouraging. I'm hoping that there is less of we already have an Indian woman writer. We already have one of these. You know, there is a recognition that nobody, for some reason, is like, we already have a white male middle-aged writer who is writing about his dissatisfaction with his marriage and his career. We're good. I will refrain from naming any names that might have just sprung to mind. But the idea in which every one of those stories is going to be different, right? You can get someone who's doing that, and they're not going to be John Cheever. They're going to have something slightly different to say, and that is useful and valid, but we need to kind of extend that same kind of value to all the other stories.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question. Earlier you said our nation has moved closer to the fictional world of our missing hearts than you wished, but let's keep hoping. What gives you hope for the future? Oh. This is the last question. You gotta bring us some hope, Celeste.
Okay, I'm watching the red clock countdown. I wish that I had really good answers for this. I don't. I will confess to you that yesterday I cut my workday short and I turned on my Nintendo Switch and I played Animal Crossing for a little while because I just needed to be in a space where like my biggest problem was like I have roaches in my imaginary character's house and I need to step on them or like whatever happens. And if you don't play Animal Crossing, that's okay. It's a lovely game, but it will suck you in and you will be forever transformed. So this is all to say that, like, as much as I talk about hope, as much as I want Our Missing Hearts to be a book that gives people hope, and I do think it does, even though I think we've talked mostly about the dark parts of it. It is, for me, a novel that came out of my trying to find hope. If any of you follow me on social media, where I'm not very much anymore, I am constantly trying to get people to believe that the world can be different, because if you just think, well, this is it, no one is going to counter Trump, and Elon has all of our social security information already, so I guess that's it, no one is going to fix this. My thought is, where do we go from there? Should we all just lie down and die? That I'm not willing to do that yet, especially someone who has a child. Very few people want to look at a child and say, the world is just absolutely fucked. Wait, am I allowed to swear in Radcliffe?
Yes, you can swear at Radcliffe.
Can I swear in Radcliffe?
Radcliffe?
Okay, the dean is giving me a thumbs up. But you don't want to say to a younger generation, we are screwed, there's no coming back, just give up now. We're still like, no, here's why you still need to put on your shoes or like eat your vegetables or whatever it is that we're trying to get you to do, right? Before we even get to, here's why we want you to care about other people and take action that is consistent with your own personal values. So this is getting to the actual question, which is that part of my hope comes from looking at the next generation, as much as I think that my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, essentially the youngest Gen Xers, as much as we like to make fun of millennials and Zoomers and everybody that comes next, honestly, the kids are all right. Like, they are smarter, thinking bigger, more empathetic than certainly I think my generation was at their age. That gives me a lot of hope. I hope that they can hold on to that. But I do think that when you think about the next generation, whether it is your own personal, family member or the kind of abstract idea of the next generation, it changes how you think about things. You're like, I do want this to be better. And maybe I will not see that change, but I do want it for you, so let me do what I can, right? I want you to be able to control what happens to your own body, so I guess I'm gonna call my congressman again, right? And I think the broader answer where I get hope, honestly, is from other people. I've spent a lot of time in the past 6 years or so, kind of despairing about the state of humanity, and the thing that always pulls me back from that is always community, and that may be very small community. Like, I run into my neighbor, and I happen to live on a street in Cambridge where we all actually know each other, which I realize is kind of a rarity, but we chat with each other, and every so often something happens. Like, there's I don't know why, this is probably a question for the city of Cambridge, but there have been a lot of car accidents at the intersection that's right near my house. And we've had the experience multiple times of all of us running out in the street to provide help. So someone will kind of flag down traffic, someone will call 911. One particular instance I remember, it was a mom with 2 kids, and she had been T-boned essentially by someone else. And she was understandably freaking out, and so some of us went out, I brought out granola bars for the kids, and someone else brought out kids' books, and we kind of kept them occupied while she spoke to the police. These feel like things that are very, very small, but I think that's kind of what keeps the fabric of society relatively hole-free, or with as few holes as possible. And going, okay, I do live in a community where people actually care about each other. you still have the days where you're like, I'm not getting out of bed and I'm just going to play Animal Crossing. But it also does kind of remind you, like, okay, I'm not in this alone. I'm not the only person who cares about what's going on. And sometimes it's a broader community. Sometimes it's a community of writers where we are all tearing our hair out and trying to figure out how do we go on with our work, why should we bother? And we give each other pep talks. I have an amazing writing group that is really good at this, where we remind ourselves, okay, art does matter. We are also still trying to help the world, but also we're trying to make art, and that's part of it too. And sometimes it is a larger community. I am always really encouraged when I see people who are joining into protests, whether that is boycotting Amazon for a week, for a day, 3 minutes, or people who are marching in the streets, everything in between. I think remembering that you're not alone is one of the things that can help you go on, and it's one of the things that I think fiction is really good at reminding people about too. Like, you read something and you go, oh, I'm not the only one who cares about this. I'm not the only one who's thinking about this. I'm not the only one who's experienced this. Hopefully you feel less alone, and that in and of itself I think is a really hopeful thing.
It's really rare to end an event on a feeling of hopefulness. So I just want to say, no, these days, hey, it's tough.
It is tough. Everything, especially when the problems feel so big, and you are one person, and there's this feeling of like, well, what can I do? Okay, I didn't take the plastic drinking straw at lunch today. Is that actually helping? I mean, it is, yes. But you start with that. Like, I think any kind of action is a muscle, right? And if you haven't had to exercise it before, you're lucky and that's wonderful. And you exercise it now, and you start with small things, and you remember that you're all doing this together. You're all refusing the plastic drinking straws, or I'm making fun of the plastic drinking straws, but I actually do think that's important. Whatever your small actions are, it adds up. And it also inspires other people. And there's a ripple effect that I think that we don't always know about. So if there's any message you're going to take from this talk today, let it be that, be the little stone that's causing the ripples to go outwards.
And don't choose the plastic drinking straw.
Don't choose the plastic drinking straws.
Yes. Celeste, thank you so
Erika,
very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Let's give Erika and Celeste another round of applause. That was fantastic, and yes, sometimes you have to be a little profane to get your point across. Thanks to the audience members for joining us today. I hope you'll join us again sometimes. You can find out about future programming by checking out our website, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.